or overcompetitive? The new China trade war. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, we welcome back Alex, who's been questioning tariffs and the role that they play in this new sort of global world order. How are you going today, Alex?
I'm going well. I'm in very cold Melbourne.
Oh, very cold Melbourne. It was a bit chilly here in Brisbane as well, but not Melbourne cold. We'll sort of be happy with that middle ground for the time being. Let's start off today. You address an area we haven't really talked that much about, to be honest. This tariff concept that it's really coming back to the fore. It's a concept that's been used many times in the past, but it's becoming really a political issue that's being pushed a lot now. My first question is, why now? The heading was overcapacity versus overcompetitive. Why is it now that we're seeing this become a real push?
Because world economies are falling apart, supply chains were disrupted during COVID, and there's a US election coming up. So the US is looking, you've got EVs, lithium batteries, solar panels, green technology that everybody wants to produce, that every government in the world has been pushing for the last 5 years. And China invested in it, and they invested in it very heavily. And so the rest of the world's worked out that they probably aren't going to compete very well. The argument here is whether it's overcapacity from China, because, for example, the EV market there right now is running at 65% capacity. So they've got plenty of room to move. Or is it that they're overly competitive? And China's argument there is that they have complete supply chains. So while the rest of the world was concentrating on free trade and, we're going to get our chip from Taiwan and we're going to get our steel from Europe, China just said, we'll do the chip, we'll do the steel, we'll do everything here. And so they're saying that they're more competitive than everyone else. And there's some reasonable argument that that's right. So what has not been an issue for the last 5 years since Trump increased tariffs back in about 2019, well, it's election year, and suddenly there's an issue with it. So the US has increased tariffs hugely across those sort of categories, and today is decision day as to whether Europe does the same.
Well, I wanted to touch on that because we've seen the European Union really follow along what the US says to do in this regard, and that potentially has consequences for them, I would imagine, particularly Germany, who's a big industrial producer. You've got not a great economic situation across Europe at the moment, and they're very heavily reliant on the Chinese market. How do you see that playing out there?
Well, I mean, whereas America sort of just turns around and says this is what we're doing, Europe and America make up about 40% of Chinese exports. So right. China, in its own way, treads carefully around the US. It's less inclined to do so with Europe, who seems to be more reliant on even the China export. Like there's huge amounts of equipment that goes from Germany to China. We've seen that China's manufacturing base over the last 2 years, because of probably mostly energy prices, has collapsed. They've probably got a bit more scope to push back China on the tariffs, and Europe is just pressing, sort of trying to step a little bit better around them rather than the US, who's the big world bully at the moment. So Europe is looking at maybe increasing tariffs on EVs from 10 to 20 or 30%. Now, their reason for doing that is saying that there's government subsidies and that's not fair trade, which is fair and reasonable, and that is always the argument behind tariffs. But they're in a bit of a predicament where, say, the German large engine market is $30 billion in exports to China a year. So if China retaliates and throws a tariff on top of them the other way, Germany's manufacturing could potentially shrink even more. So Europe is being asked to follow the US, but they're thinking very hard about whether they will.
And I was saying this to you before we started recording. I remember back to the days where we were in a very heavily tariffed and regulated environment, and there was a big push towards globalization, and this, we need to get rid of all these tariffs. It feels like the pendulum has swung completely the other way now, where it's, well, we can't have free trade. We can't have all these people actually working to their competitive advantage. We've now got to go in and really force our economy to produce the things that we wanted to produce, whether it's a good idea to do it or not. The problem with that, as you highlight in the article today, is inflation. And it's a real issue, because you can clearly see, if you start whacking these big percentages on top of the costs of everything, that results in higher costs at the end of that chain. Like, that's pretty straightforward and logical. You had a historical example in there. Can you really draw some conclusions from how you're looking at this, of where we could end up if we go down this heavily tariffed future?
Well, I mean, Argentina in the 1960s introduced huge tariffs of around 16 to 18%. They've slowly been bringing them back off. With Milei coming into power this year, they're gone. So they officially now have a free and open economy, and their inflation this year has gone from about 25% month on month to 8%. So it's probably the best representation of inflation dropping worldwide, because they've gotten rid of the tariffs. Whereas, Europe and the US are looking at increasing them on cheaper products. So, there's very good reasons why you need to protect your manufacturing base. I'm a strong believer that everyone's gone too far in free trade, but by doing it in such a, you could maybe limit imports in such a way that the rest of the world doesn't build so much capacity. China was told the world's going green. China did not have a property market.
Yep.
China went green. It is not an unreasonable thing that they did. They're the biggest manufacturing country in the world. They followed what the world asked them to do, and now they're potentially being punished for it. Just, I guess, the signaling from the world that, this is what we're going to do, and this, but without saying this is how we need to do it, just creates overcapacity, creates distorted trade. And now we're going to be punished with tariffs right when we're trying to control inflation. Well, a tariff is just another tax that the government can spend somewhere else. And let's be honest, we're overtaxed and we're over it at the moment. And if you add a tax to something, it just costs more. And that is inflation.
And that's such a good point about China that you've been making here, that what else were they supposed to do? It's not like they've got a booming economy right now, right? Like, they're in a lot of financial difficulty. They're struggling, even against the back of opening up and doing all of that production. So it's difficult, because they will be looking, from their perspective, they'll be looking at it going, well, the US is allowed to do this. Like, that's what forms their, economic miracle that is the US. We should be able to do that too. Do you think that is possibly behind? You mentioned the bond sales, right? The gold reserves. We've got China selling off US government debt, increasing its gold reserves. Are they playing the game a little bit here, going, well, okay, if you're not letting us have our fair share of it, we're going to dump your debt and create problems? I mean, that seems very inflammatory in terms of US-China economic relationship.
Inflammatory and inflationary. So they've done both. So, I think everyone in the world right now knows that the US has a huge inflation problem. Their deficits are growing. If their treasury prices go up, so the interest on their treasuries go up, the US is digging itself a bigger and bigger hole. So you've got two arguments here. Maybe it's retaliatory, and maybe China is, trying to get their inflation up to teach them a lesson. The other bit is maybe these countries, not just China, look at India repatriating all its gold the other day.
Yes.
These countries are probably getting pretty worried about the reserve status of an inflationary deficit hungry country that is reacting like Argentina reacted in the 1960s, when it was, the 1920s, it was one of the strongest economies in the world. It added tariffs, it added government jobs, it added expenditure. It's not too different to what's going on in the US at the moment. So I'd say a lot of countries are probably fairly scared about where this is going.
Absolutely. I think that has to be part of the trend that we're seeing, that people are looking out for themselves, which it all leads back to this idea of tariffs, really. Everyone's looking after their own back and not really thinking about the broader picture, and that creates big problems down the track. We've seen that historically. I suppose I want to wrap up, bringing it back home to Australia. Last time we were in this situation under a Trump presidency, we had pressure to really put up tariffs, and we I believe probably overplayed our hand a bit there. So we went to China and said, well, okay, we're going to do this, and they retaliated, and we did not like it. And I think we came off far worse out of that situation and really ended up having to backpedal. We're only sort of really getting out of that now. What's your take on that angle when you think about Australia specifically?
Well, it wasn't just the tariffs, like it was the tariffs in the US and Australia supporting US policy, but it was also Australia saying China's possibly responsible for the coronavirus and we'd like an investigation.
Yep.
And China being quite unhappy about that, which is fair enough. You poke a bear, you get hurt. So, the US is its own bear. If the bear wants to poke another bear, it's probably okay. But we are not. And last time, I think April was the first month where the wine tariffs finally got unwound.
Yep.
So back in 2019, we were 30% of China's wine exports. Well, in March, we were 1.4%. And let's be honest, Australian wine is great, so is French. So French got up to sort of 30, 40% during that period. You can't poke something unless you are a bear, and we were not. And Europe must be recognizing the same thing. They want to export to China. There's economies like Germany, which traditionally has been the strongest economy in Europe, that has been decimated by not being able to export to China. They are not the bear that the US is, and they'll be treading carefully. And I think Australia going forward will be treading carefully. There is no talk of us putting tariffs on EVs. In fact, we are saying bring it on, because we've already destroyed our automotive industry. So that's gone. They're all good for the other side now.
So for the time being, at least, I suppose would be the answer there, that we don't really know what comes with the next administration, whichever side of politics that is, if there is that increasing pressure, whether we are forced to reassess that. But for the time being, we're playing a bit cautious because we're still recovering from the last time we overplayed our bear status.
Well, Albanese has just come out with some policies around green manufacturing and but more, by the look of things, subsidizing the industry as opposed to putting tariffs on. So that would be one, possibly matching the way China is operating. I actually don't know if they're subsidizing their industries, maybe, probably. Whereas America is not going to go down the same path that we're going to. They just it's just protectionism that they have labeled overcapacity.
And it's a game we've played before and no doubt we'll be about to play again. So thank you for all that work today, Alex. I think that's a really interesting topic, and it's one that we'll come back to again, but we haven't really touched on it much. So I think it was a good overview today of really what's going on, and it's quite complex out there. So thank you for that.
Thank you for having me again.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.